Feeling stuck in cycles of binge eating is one of the most frustrating and exhausting experiences we can have with food. And there's no shortage of people trying to tell you what you should do to fix that. The unfortunate thing is that most people don't really understand how binge eating works and how to break the cycle effectively, because so much of the information out there about dieting and nutrition starts to work very differently for people who do struggle with binge eating. So in this video, I'm going to share with you the most common mistakes people make and how to fix them when it comes to breaking the binge eating cycle. I struggled with my own relationship with food for like over a decade, and a lot of these mistakes I made myself. It's part of the reason why I was struggling for so long. So one thing before we jump into this, it's really important to remember that there's a difference between binge eating and overeating. Binge eating is experiencing what feels like a loss of control, feeling unable to stop, and eating well past discomfort pretty frequently. Overeating is a bit more like just eating more than you planned or eating more than you think you should. This is an important distinction to make because how we break cycles of binge eating versus how we deal with consistent overeating are a little bit different. But a lot of the stuff in this video still applies to both situations. So let's get into it. The first major trip up that people have when experiencing binge eating is trying to compensate for the binge the following day or later in the day by fasting or not eating for as long as possible. This might be just because you're trying to make up for it. This might be because you're genuinely not hungry the day after a binge. But either way, what this does is it keeps the roller coaster of binge eating and restriction going. Binges don't exist in isolation. They are usually one part of a pattern of behavior or a pattern of habits with food. So we can't just look at binge eating like it's happening on an island with nothing going on around it. We need to look at binge eating as a restrict, binge, restrict cycle in most cases. So even if you're not hungry after a binge, I'm not saying you need to go and eat like a full, really rich, dense meal, because you probably won't feel like it, but it's important just to keep the rhythm of regular meals and snacks going rather than to try and compensate for that binge by doing some kind of fasting or avoiding food. Remember, we want to get off the roller coaster, not keep it going by restricting after the binge. Sounds counterintuitive, I know, but this is just one of the reasons why so many people struggle and why people like me stayed stuck for so long. It does seem counterintuitive and it will be challenging. These are the steps we need to take. Now, there are a lot of mixed messages about fasting out there. Even some doctors will come out and say that fasting is a really, really healthy thing for us to do. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole about whether fasting is good or not, because that's a really complex kind of question. What I can say though, is for people struggling with binge eating or disordered eating, fasting is contraindicated. And as always, I know there's going to be a few people out there that say, I was struggling with binge eating and I started fasting and my whole life changed and now I'm better. Okay, cool, I hear you, 100%. But that is not the typical result of fasting, especially with someone struggling with binge eating. So I know we're on social media and everyone has a slightly different experience, but unless you're talking to me one-on-one about your unique experience, we're talking in generalizations here, and we're going by the evidence. And reliable evidence supports the idea that for people struggling with binge eating or disordered eating, fasting usually makes situations worse. So whether you're hungry or not, we're looking for a steady rhythm of meals and snacks throughout the day. 3 meals, 2 or 3 snacks, starting with breakfast within a couple of hours of waking up. And whenever I say this, there's always some people that say, Marcus, I'm not hungry in the morning or I'm not hungry during the day. And that can happen for a lot of reasons. It could be that you're not accustomed to eating during the day. It could be caffeine. It could be stress, any number of things. But usually when someone says, I'm struggling with binge eating and I'm not eating during the day because I'm not hungry, we're paying interest on the decision to not eat during the day when all that catches up to us in the evening. Whether we feel hungry or not, our body needs to eat, our body needs food, our body needs energy, and if we're not eating during the day, that hunger, that need is going to catch up to us in the evening when our mental clarity is lower, our mental and emotional resilience is lower, and our inhibition is lower. So the first thing we need to do to break the binge eating cycle is to set this steady rhythm of meals and snacks and get ahead of your hunger, rather than trying to compensate for decisions that you made earlier in the day or the previous day. Again, I know this sounds really counterintuitive, but this is one of the reasons why people struggle most with binge eating. Another common trap that people fall into is restricting particular foods or food groups, like swearing off carbs or swearing off sugar, saying that those things trigger a binge and I can't eat them, and etc., etc. Now, I deeply understand. Really, I do. There was a time in my life where I felt completely powerless while being around certain foods. I couldn't have a bite of chocolate without just obsessing over it and not being able to think about anything else until I ate more. I couldn't eat a slice of pizza or a slice of cake without feeling so kind of emotionally mixed up about it that, again, I couldn't think of anything else until I'd either compensated for that choice by over-exercising or under-eating, or had just said, oh, well, screw it. I may as well make the most of it today, seeing I've already had some, and made a day of it. When we label certain foods and food groups as problematic or poisonous or something to be avoided at all costs, as tempting as that might seem as a strategy, doing that increases our mental and emotional preoccupation with that food. For example, whatever you do right now, don't think about elephants. For the love of God, don't think about elephants. In fact, don't think about any African animal, just to be safe. For the rest of this video, don't think about elephants, lions, cheetahs, or zebras. You get where this is going, right? As counterintuitive as it sounds, labeling certain foods as things that we can't have, it makes us think about them more, and then we lose our ability to eat them in moderation. Again, this is going to sound weird, but think of those foods like things that we need practice with, like in order to eat in moderation. It's pretty normal to find certain foods difficult to stop eating. These things have been thought up by some food scientists that are really keen on making stuff that's super delicious. So yeah, it makes sense that these foods are hard to stop eating. Things with a lot of, like, the combination in particular of sugars, fats, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, they're hard to stop eating because they taste delicious and they don't really fill you up as much. So yeah, you can eat a lot of them. That's not an accident. You know, that was a decision. But that doesn't really mean that these foods are somehow evil or really bad or terrible. I know there's a lot of noise out there about them, but the more we label them as evil or bad or addictive or whatever, the higher the emotional charge around those foods, the more we think about them, the bigger the emotional consequences if we do actually eat them, which reinforces that cycle, the emotional and psychological cycle of binge eating, that whole roller coaster, which is numbness and bliss, or whatever you want to call it, when the actual binge is happening, followed by shame and guilt and awfulness in the dip after the binge, which we then often rescue ourselves from by eating food again in a bingey kind of way, which is the numbness, escape, bliss, whatever it might be, followed again by another dip into shame and guilt and self-hatred and all those terrible things. So if there are foods out there that we're labeling as just bad and terrible and we can't eat them, the moment we do eat them, it perpetuates this whole emotional cycle. And we have really reliable evidence to suggest that things like shame and guilt are more likely to drive people in to the avoidant or self-limiting coping strategies or habits that they're trying to avoid, rather than help them actually pull themselves out of it. I know shame and guilt is a big ticket industry. People out there going, essentially, in one way or another, you're shitty, you're bad for doing this, you should do better, change. And that creates a temporary boost in motivation, but sooner or later, reinforcing that shame just sends us back into whatever we're trying to stop, whatever we're trying to avoid. So for so many reasons, trying to avoid things like carbs and sugar and whatever else is a bit of a self-defeating strategy. However, that doesn't mean that we just go for it willy-nilly with those foods and hope that everything turns out okay. I actually don't have a lot of patience for the people out there who say things like unconditional permission with food, eat whatever you want, but then don't add some context to that. Because if you're trying to include those foods that are often a struggle, but not including them as part of balanced meals or as part of a nice regular rhythm of meals and snacks that include, proteins and fiber and all this kind of stuff, then things are going to get out of hand really quickly. So when we look at practicing being able to eat certain foods in a way that doesn't lead to a binge, it's important that those foods are a part of a balanced meal rather than just, oh, I'm starving, let lunch be a packet of chips. Because there's only one way that that's going to go. In most cases, yeah, I know there's someone out there who wants to tell me, my whole pathway out of this was eating nothing but chips for lunch. I'm sure that guy exists, but I don't know what to do with that. Outliers exist. Outliers are a thing. Don't build your strategy on information given to you by an outlier. And when there are medical concerns, this is hard. A lot of people I work with get told by their doctor, you're pre-diabetic, you need to do something, cut out the sugary snacks. And navigating that path is particularly hard. Because when I talk about unconditional permission and breaking the binge eating cycle and everything, my goal for you is not that you live in your basement eating Twinkies for the rest of your life. I want you to be happy. I want you to be healthy. Are Twinkies even still a thing, by the way? Or is that just my childhood talking? I digress. What I'm showing up here to tell you is that the pathway to eating healthier doesn't always look the way we think it's going to look. It doesn't always look like saying, you know what, today I go on a diet. Today, forever, I'm eating this many calories or under. I'm never eating bread and sugar again. That's not how it looks a lot of the time. So if there are medical concerns, again, I'm not a doctor, but what we do know about what reliably leads to improvements with food choices for people who've struggled with binge eating is that shame and restriction is not really a part of the successful formula. Regular balanced meals, putting an emphasis on getting enough of the right kind of nutrients rather than focusing on eliminating things that you're trying not to have. And when it comes to carbs and cravings and sugars and all this stuff, meeting yourself in the middle can be really important. There might be foods that you really struggle with. There might be foods that reliably lead to a binge every single time. And then on the other end of the scale, there are these foods that are just hyper healthy and fine. Meet yourself in the middle a little bit. I call this eating more yellow light foods. So red light foods are the things that you might really struggle with. Green light foods are the things that you just know are really healthy and that there's no problem with. Yellow light foods are these things that kind of meet in the middle. For me personally, a yellow light food was a burger when I was trying to break my own cycle of binge eating. Things like chocolate and pizza and ice cream, I would binge every time if I tried to eat that stuff. But then on the other end, I was living on steamed vegetables and poached chicken and just the really basic, bland stuff. So giving myself permission to have a burger started to give me a bit more practice with eating more delicious foods in moderation, and it meant that when I eventually did have a bit more of the other stuff, of the chocolate, of the chips, of the pizza, it wasn't this massive pendulum swing into having this really bland stuff and then, oh my God, suddenly this is just crazy delicious. Give yourself permission to go down the middle. It's gonna help. And the final thing I want to address here is the myth that when you start breaking away from binge eating, it's just a joyful process. The cycle of binge eating is a downward spiral, right? Climbing out of the cycle of binge eating is an upward spiral. The first few steps or the first few phases of an upward spiral are going to feel worse temporarily than how it feels to stay in the downward spiral. This is what keeps people stuck. So you're going to be faced with this situation where you start to make improvements, you start to make changes, and you're not going to feel immediately better or immediately different. It might even feel worse for a minute. But that needs to be framed as a positive thing. I know it's rough, but that needs to be okay. You need to be able to recognize that as like, this is a good sign. This is a sign I'm on the right path. This is a sign I'm doing something good. Breaking the cycle of binge eating is not a joyful process. It feels like falling out of a tree and hitting every single branch on the way down most of the time. But we go through that in the name of the rest of our lives being so much better. Being able to go out to dinner with friends without freaking out about food. Being able to wake up in the morning not feeling that food hangover. Feeling good about how we're acting in alignment with our values and we're acting in a way with food that we can be proud of. That's how the rest of our lives can look if we take these difficult steps to climb out of the downward spiral of binge eating. So I just want to prepare you for that. If you're thinking that doing well means immediately feeling better, you're setting yourself up for a really rough journey. Lean into the difficulty. Binge eating is something that numbs our emotions and numbs our experience pretty effectively. So when we move away from avoidant or numbing habits, the world might feel a bit prickly for a minute. You're going to go from having this habit that allows you to just numb all your feelings and numb your experience of the world to just raw dogging it. And that's hard. But like I mentioned, that challenge means that you're on the right path. So in summary, we've got to pull ourselves away from compensating for the binge by fasting. Connect with the idea that the more we try to eliminate or ban certain foods, the more preoccupied we get with them. The harder it is to stop eating them or to eat moderate amounts of them. And including all foods and feeling peaceful and confident around all foods isn't about just going, hey, free for all, I'm just going to eat whatever. No. There is a structure to this. Regular balanced meals and snacks. Set that rhythm. The goal is to arrive at every meal and snack ready to eat but not starving. Allow yourself to experiment with this, be prepared for it to be uncomfortable at times, and reach out to me if you have any questions. My name's Marcus, this was Strong Not Starving. See you in the next video.